The dust of the high plains tasted of promise, a fine golden powder that settled on the canvas of the wagons and the dark hair of the travelers. An Lee traced the character for home into the film on a water barrel, the wood warm beneath her fingertips. She was 20, and the world was an immense, unfolding map of ochre and sapphire. Her father spoke of a valley, a place where the soil was rich and they could plant the seeds they had carried across an entire ocean. Here, he said, they would not be ghosts, they would be roots. She wore a cheongsam of simple gray silk, a garment meant for a different world, but the only one she had of any quality. It felt thin against the vastness of the American sky. The days were a rhythm of creaking wheels and murmured conversations in their dialect, a small island of familiarity in a sea of alien sagebrush and distant, tooth-like mountains. The other family shared their hopes around the evening fires, their faces lit with a flickering, fragile optimism. They were so far from the celestial empire, so far from everything they had ever known, but in that shared distance they had forged a bond as strong as any village wall. The attack came not with a warning cry or the thunder of hooves, but with a sudden, sharp silence. The chirping of insects ceased. The gentle murmur of the wind died. Then a single piercing crack echoed from the bluffs above, and the man walking lead beside the ox team fell, a red flower blooming on his chest. There was no time for a scream to form in An Lee's throat. The world dissolved into a cacophony of gunfire, splintering wood, and the terrified cries of her people. Men with faces obscured by dust and cruelty descended upon them, their movements efficient and utterly without mercy. Her father pushed her down, his body a shield. "Run," he whispered, the word a puff of finality against her ear. "Live." Then he was gone, pulled away into the chaos, and she was scrambling under the wagon, the gray silk of her dress catching on a splintered floorboard, tearing with a sound that was lost in the greater violence. An Lee crawled through the sagebrush, the thorns tearing at her skin and the torn silk of her dress. The scent of gunpowder and blood was a suffocating blanket on the air. She did not look back. To look back was to see the end of her world, the extinguishing of every light she had ever known. Her father's final word, "Live," was a drumbeat in her chest, a frantic command that propelled her forward when all she wanted to do was curl into the earth and let it swallow her. Her lungs burned, each breath a shard of glass. She ran until the sounds of the massacre faded into the rhythmic pounding of her own heart, until the plains gave way to the broken, rocky foothills of the mountains that had once seemed so distant. A cold dusk was settling, bleeding purple and orange into the bruised sky, and the temperature was dropping fast. She knew she could not survive a night in the open. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm the primal instinct that drove her. Then she saw it. A fissure in a rock face, partially obscured by a thicket of hardy winter-brown bushes. It was not a grand opening, but a dark, narrow split, a wound in the stone. Squeezing through, she found herself in a small, dry cavern, no bigger than the back of the wagon she had just fled. It smelled of stone and damp earth, a clean, ancient scent that was a shocking contrast to the horror she had left behind. She collapsed onto the cold floor, the adrenaline finally deserting her, leaving behind an emptiness so profound it was a physical weight. Grief came then, a silent, racking storm that shook her small frame until there were no tears left. The sun vanished completely, and a profound darkness filled the cave, a blackness matched only by the void in her soul. In that absolute stillness, huddled in her tattered cheongsam, An Lee made a promise to the memory of her father. She would not just live, she would endure. The first snows came early that year, a soft white blanket that covered the sins of the land and entombed An Lee in her sanctuary of stone. The world outside her cave became a landscape of stark, silent beauty, but for her it was a prison. The snow concealed her presence, but it also locked her in, a constant, freezing reminder of her isolation. Survival became a brutal calculus of calories and warmth. Her days were governed by a simple, desperate rhythm. She learned the patterns of the small creatures that shared her desolate world, setting crude snares for rabbits and squirrels with threads pulled from the hem of her ruined dress. She learned which roots were safe to eat, their bitter taste a welcome fire in her perpetually empty stomach. Her father had been a scholar, not a farmer, but he had taught her to observe, to see the world not just for what it was, but for what it could provide. That knowledge, once a pleasant pastime, was now the thread from which her life hung. Fire was her most precious and most dangerous ally. A small, smokeless fire, built deep in the cave using a piece of flint she had found, was her nightly ritual. It held the life-threatening chill at bay and was the only light in her endless darkness. She would sit before it, the flames dancing in her wide, haunted eyes, her gray cheongsam now little more than a collection of stitched-together rags. The silk, once a symbol of a life of modest dignity, was now a testament to her tenacity. Months bled into one another, marked only by the phases of the moon she could glimpse through the crack in the rock. The loneliness was a physical entity, a constant companion that whispered of despair in the long, silent nights. She spoke to the ghosts of her family, her voice a raw, unused thing in the confines of the cave, just to remember the sound of it. The vibrant, hopeful girl who had traced characters on a water barrel was gone, burned away by trauma and forged into something harder, quieter, and infinitely more resilient. Jedediah moved through the snow-laden pines with a silence that belied his size. He was a man made of the mountains themselves, broad of shoulder and thick with muscle earned from a life of hard solitude. His hair and beard were long and streaked with the first hints of gray, a wild mane that merged with the fur collar of his coat. He checked his trap lines with an economy of motion that was its own form of grace, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the story written in the snow. He knew the track of every creature in his territory, from the heavy print of a bull elk to the delicate stitching of a field mouse. That was why he stopped, his gaze fixed on a series of marks near a frozen creek bed. They were small, blurred by wind and new snow, but they were unmistakably wrong. They were not the prints of a deer, nor a coyote. They were too deliberate, too light. It looked almost like the track of a person, but a person impossibly small and light of foot, wearing something other than a proper boot. Curiosity, a rare indulgence for a man like him, took hold. He abandoned the trap line for the day, his focus shifting entirely to this new mystery. For 3 days he followed the faint trail. It was a master class in tracking a ghost. The trail would vanish on wind-swept ridges and reappear in the shelter of a ravine. He saw where the phantom had dug for roots beneath the snow and found the discarded remains of a snared rabbit, the bones picked clean. This was no lost hunter. This was a survivor, someone living off the land with a desperate, clever tenacity that he could not help but respect. The tracks led him higher, into the broken, rocky country he seldom visited. They grew fresher, the edges sharper in the snow. He slowed his pace, his senses on high alert. He was entering another's territory now, and in these mountains, that was a thing to be done with caution. The trail finally ended at a dense thicket of brush clinging to a sheer rock face. There was no way through, yet the tracks led directly into it. He stood for a long moment, the cold air misting his breath, and listened. There was nothing but the sigh of the wind through the pines. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was no longer alone. He pushed aside the stiff, frozen branches, the scratching sound loud in the immense silence. The opening was a mere sliver of black against the gray stone. He crouched, his large frame filling the entrance, and peered into the gloom. A faint, smoky smell, almost imperceptible, clung to the air. His eyes, long accustomed to the shifting light of the forest, adjusted slowly. He saw a flicker of movement in the deepest recess of the cave, and then two wide, dark eyes staring back at him, luminous with terror. An Li was pressed against the far wall, a sharpened rock held tight in her small hands. She looked like a cornered animal, her body coiled, ready to fight a battle she could not possibly win. The tattered gray rags of her Chong Sam blended with the shadows, making her seem like a spirit of the rock itself. Jedediah did not move. He did not speak. He simply held her gaze, letting her see that his hands were empty, his posture unthreatening. He saw the hollows in her cheeks, the fierce, haunted look that spoke of unspeakable trauma. He remained there for what felt like an hour, a silent, unmoving mountain of a man blocking the only exit, yet making no move to enter. Slowly, deliberately, he unslung the leather pack from his shoulders. He reached inside and pulled out a piece of dried venison and a small, hard biscuit. He placed them on the ground, just inside the cave entrance, and then he backed away, retreating through the bushes and sitting on a nearby rock, his back to the cave. He built no fire. He made no sound. He simply waited. Hours passed. The sun began its descent, painting the snow in hues of pink and gold. Just as the last light faded, he heard a faint scuttling from the cave. The food was gone. He did not turn. He remained on his rock, a patient guardian, as a new, fragile understanding settled between the ghost of the mountain and the man who had found her. He returned the next day, and the day after that, each time leaving a small offering of food, each time retreating to his silent vigil. On the fourth day, as he approached, she was standing just outside the cave, bathed in the pale winter sun, waiting. He brought her back to his cabin, a small, sturdy structure of hewn logs nestled in a hidden valley, its chimney breathing a steady plume of white smoke into the crisp air. The journey was slow, An Li's strength still fragile. Inside, a fire crackled in a stone hearth, and the single room was filled with the scent of pine, curing leather, and wood smoke. It was the first true warmth she had felt in months, a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to thaw not just her body, but some of the ice that had formed around her heart. For days they existed in a shared silence, broken only by the necessities of survival. He would hunt, she would tend the fire and mend her tattered dress with a needle and thread he provided. He watched her careful, precise movements, a quiet dignity that had somehow survived everything. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he finally broke the quiet. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. An Li flinched at the directness of the question. With hesitant, broken English and drawings in the ash on the hearthstone, she told her story. A wagon, a family, men with rifles. She drew a symbol she had seen on the saddlebags of the attackers, a stylized S intertwined with a railroad spike. Jedediah's face hardened as he looked at the drawing, his eyes narrowing into slits of cold fury. He knew the mark. "Sterling," he said, the name a curse on his lips. Bartholomew Sterling. He explained that Sterling was a man buying land for the coming railroad, a man who believed the country belonged to him and that progress was an excuse for any atrocity. He didn't use threats or money. He used fear. He cleared the land of anyone who wouldn't sell, anyone who might be a witness, leaving behind nothing but stories of phantom bandits. "They weren't robbers," Jedediah said, his voice grim. "They were executioners. Your people were on land he wanted. He didn't want to buy it. He wanted to erase it." The revelation landed on An Li with the force of a physical blow. The massacre had not been a random act of savagery. It was calculated. It was business. The weight of her survival shifted. It was no longer just a personal victory over nature. It was an act of defiance against a powerful, unseen enemy. Her grief was now mingled with a cold, hard rage. A new purpose settled over the small cabin, a shared resolve that needed few words. An Li was no longer just a survivor. She was a witness. Jedediah was no longer just a recluse. He was a protector with a cause. The quiet companionship between them deepened, forged now in the heat of a shared mission. He saw the steel in her, the unyielding spirit behind the quiet facade. She saw the fierce morality in him, a code of justice as unshakable as the mountains he called home. "He will have a record," Jedediah stated one evening, staring into the flames. "Men like Sterling, they are vain. They write things down." He explained that Sterling's main survey camp was 2 days' ride north, a temporary settlement where his enforcers gathered and his plans were laid. It was a viper's nest, but it was also the most likely place to find proof. A ledger, a map, a payroll connecting him directly to the men who had destroyed her family. To go there was madness, but to do nothing felt like a betrayal of the dead. Anli looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "We go," she said, her voice clear and steady. The decision hung in the air, solid and irrevocable. In the days that followed, a subtle shift occurred. The space between them, once filled with cautious silence, now held a different kind of tension, a current of mutual reliance and a dawning, unspoken affection. He would watch her as she practiced her English, her brow furrowed in concentration, and a feeling he couldn't name would stir in his chest. She would watch him sharpen his axe, the play of muscle under his shirt, and feel a sense of safety that was entirely new to her. One afternoon, as a light snow fell outside, he found a length of soft, dark blue wool in his supply chest and laid it on the table. "For a new dress," he said gruffly, not meeting her eyes. "Winter is not over." The gesture was simple, practical, yet it felt like a profound promise. A promise of a future beyond survival, a future where there could be such things as new dresses and a life rebuilt from ashes. She touched the fabric, its warmth a stark contrast to the threadbare silk she still wore, and for the first time in a very long time she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. They traveled under the cover of a brewing storm, the sky a bruised purple and the wind carrying the sharp bite of more snow. The survey camp was a scar on the landscape, a collection of tents and crude structures huddled in a clearing, smoke from a central bonfire twisting into the agitated sky. They watched from a high ridge as darkness fell and the promised blizzard began, the snow coming down in a thick, swirling curtain that muffled sound and reduced visibility. It was the perfect cover. "The main tent, the one with the stovepipe," Jedediah murmured, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "That's Sterling's. He won't be there, but his things will be." He laid a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm and reassuring. "You are small. Quick. I will make them look the other way. Get the book. Anything with his name and theirs. Then get out." Anli nodded, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was terrified, but the fear was overshadowed by a cold, clear resolve. This was for her father, for everyone. Jedediah slipped away into the swirling snow like a phantom. Moments later, a commotion erupted on the far side of the camp, a stack of supply crates collapsing with a tremendous crash. Men shouted, grabbing lanterns and running toward the sound. It was the diversion. Anli moved, a gray shadow against the white snow, flitting between tents until she reached Sterling's. She slipped under the flap, her senses overwhelmed by the smell of cigar smoke, whiskey, and oiled leather. A lantern cast a warm glow over a large wooden desk. On it lay a thick, leather-bound ledger. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, columns of names were listed next to dates and payment amounts. Her eyes scanned the page, and she saw it. A date that matched the day of the massacre, and beside it, a list of names under the heading, "Clearance, Willow Creek." She grabbed the ledger just as the tent flap was thrown open. A hulking man with a cruel, scarred face stood silhouetted against the storm. "Well now," he sneered, "what's this little mouse found?" Before he could move, Jedediah was there, a silent storm of fury. He slammed into the man, and the two giants crashed back out into the blizzard. "Go!" Jedediah roared. An Lee didn't hesitate. Clutching the ledger to her chest, she fled into the blinding white chaos of the storm. The journey to Fort Wallace, the nearest outpost of law and order, was a desperate flight. They pushed themselves and their horses through the biting wind and deep snow, knowing Sterling's men would be hunting them as soon as the storm broke. The ledger was wrapped in oilskin and tucked securely in Jedediah's saddlebag, a heavy burden of proof that was their only hope. An Lee rode beside him, no longer a fragile survivor but a partner in their dangerous gambit. The shared ordeal had stripped away all pretense, leaving a bond of absolute trust. They arrived at the fort 2 days later, exhausted and frostbitten, to find a muddy, chaotic settlement teeming with soldiers, trappers, and prospectors. They sought out the office of the territorial marshal, a man named Abram Calloway. Calloway was a veteran of the wars, a man with weary eyes and a reputation for being incorruptible, but also deeply pragmatic. He listened to their story without interruption, his gaze shifting from Jedediah's grim face to An Lee's quiet intensity. He studied the symbol she drew in the dust on his desk, his expression unreadable. When they presented the ledger, he took it, his fingers tracing the embossed S on the cover. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the columns of names and figures. The silence in the small office stretched, thick with tension. "Bartholomew Sterling is a powerful man," Calloway said finally, his voice flat. "He's financing half the territory. Accusing him of this is like accusing the sun of rising. You need more than a stolen book." Jedediah slammed his hand on the desk. "That book has the names, the dates, and this woman is a witness." Calloway looked at An Lee, truly looked at her for the first time, seeing not just a victim but the steel that had allowed her to endure. He saw the truth in her haunted eyes. He was quiet for a long moment, weighing the political risk against the stark evidence of a crime that stained the very soul of the frontier. He closed the ledger with a decisive snap. "All right," he said, rising from his chair. "I'll issue the warrant, but you two need to disappear. Sterling's reach is long. When this hornet's nest gets stirred, you don't want to be anywhere near it." The arrest of Bartholomew Sterling sent shockwaves through the territory. His empire of corruption, built on intimidation and blood, began to crumble as the ledger exposed a web of bribery and violence that reached into the highest offices. The trial was a sensation, a battle between frontier justice and the corrupting influence of money and power. An Lee, kept in protective custody, gave her testimony. She spoke not with hatred, but with a quiet, devastating clarity, her voice filling the courtroom, her story painting a picture so vivid and horrifying that it left no room for doubt. Jedediah stood at the back of the room, a silent, watchful guardian, his presence a mountain of support. In the end, justice prevailed. Sterling was convicted, his enforcers rounded up, and the truth of the Willow Creek Massacre was laid bare for all to see. The law, he explained, was a slow river, but its current ran strong and deep. It was a bittersweet victory. It would not bring back her family, but it honored their memory. It ensured that they were not just forgotten victims, but the cause for a cleansing of the land they had hoped to call home. Months later, when the dust had settled, An Lee stood with Jedediah on a ridge overlooking the valley where her family's journey had so brutally ended. The snows had melted, and the land was green with the promise of spring. She wore a simple dress of dark blue wool. "What will you do now?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. She looked out at the vast open country, a landscape that had once been her prison and was now a symbol of her resilience. It held no more fear for her. "I will plant roots," she said, looking at him. "Here." A future was not something she had dared to dream of in the long, cold months in the cave. But standing here, beside this quiet, powerful man who had shown her justice and kindness, it felt not only possible, but inevitable. He reached out and took her hand, his large, calloused fingers enveloping hers. They did not speak again for a long time, simply standing together as the sun set. Two solitary figures who had found in each other a home in the heart of the wild. The world ahead was uncertain, but for the first time it was not empty. It was full of promise.